First off, welcome everyone. I'm Cam Lawrence, the CEO here at Newlab. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this critical discussion about the future of mobility in India amid the climate crisis. We are gathered here at a pivotal moment in history as we face the twin challenges of both the climate crisis as well as the need to drive sustainable development. The future of mobility lies at the heart of this transformation, and there's no country more central to this journey than India. As the world's most populous nation, India stands at the crossroads where its actions will shape the future of the global response to climate change. With over 1.4 billion people and a rapidly urbanizing economy, the mobility solutions India adopts will not only address the sustainability challenges, but also set the example for the rest of the world. The shift to clean, green, and efficient modes of transportation is not just a matter of necessity, it is an opportunity to lead in innovation, equity, as well as environmental stewardship. Today, we are joined by a distinguished group of leaders, each playing a unique and significant role in the future of mobility and sustainability in India. First, Sandeep Balmer, our moderator, the founder and co-managing partner at Green Frontier Capital, as well as a board member at Newlab, where he plays a critical role in both innovation sustainable transportation solutions that meet the demands of a climate-challenged future. We will delve into policy frameworks, technological advancements, and the innovations that can drive transformation while keeping India's unique social and economic dynamics in mind. Let's begin this crucial conversation of how India can not only adapt, but lead the global future of mobility. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sandeep.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Cam, for that introduction. I'd like to kind of welcome our guests on stage. And I want to kind of specially say a thank you to Newlab. You know, it's really interesting. India and China have 40% of the population of the world. By the way, you can come on while I'm talking. Yeah, you can. Nobody else wanted. Yeah. But this is the only event focusing on the global south during the entire climate week. Think about that. And we need to do a lot more of these events because you can't solve the world's climate problems out of the United States. You got to do it through China, and you got to do it through India, and you got to do it through Indonesia. So thank you, Cam, for allowing us this platform. And thank you all for coming here. It's going to be a really fun and enjoyable conversation. So without further ado, since everyone's already been introduced here, I'd like to kind of start this panel with the first question to Tarun. Tarun, given your extensive research in emerging markets, can you tell us a little bit about what role will innovation in the mobility space in India drive for decisions in terms of leadership for the global south? So India obviously plays a very critical role, right, for the global south. What role do you think that innovation in India will play?
Thanks, Sandeep, and thanks, Cam, and thank you to Newlab for hosting us. It's great to see so many friends on the panel with me. You know, the funny thing that I'm thinking of, Sandeep, when you said innovation in India is we've all seen those cartoons on social media where there's a guy on a bike and it's piled up with a bullock at the back and there's a tractor and some kind of hybrid contraption That's innovation, right? We've always had innovation in India. There's always people doing what we call jugaad in India traditionally, or doing some kind of ham-fisted adaptation to local resource constraints. So in a sense, the innovative DNA is very much alive and well. And I don't think that's unique to India. I mean, I think it's pretty much any developing country, you'll see it on the streets all the time. So I think it's always been there, and it will continue to be a big deal. What's different now compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago is we've got a bunch of people like Puneet, doing amazing thing, and Sanjay, innovating at the forefront in different ways, leveraging whatever technological assets are available in the ecosystem. So that will continue to play a role, and I think we're just at that so-called inflection point of hockey stick growth in that kind of innovation. There is parallel innovation going on in the policy space. At the behest of the PMO at the time, I had been responsible for creating something called the Atal Innovation Mission, which is a policy framework in India to trigger hundreds of incubators, thousands of maker spaces across the country. It's a small Lego-like piece in the edifice that's being created, and I expect that to continue to develop. I think one area that we need to do a lot more of is invest in science, frankly. Our investment in science of all sorts, especially and including so many things that are abutting mobility, whether it's better materials or what have you, is abysmally low and actually trending in the wrong direction if you look at R&D to GDP ratios compared to most other countries. So that's a real headwind. I think it's addressable if we have a movement and if we educate the policymakers. But whether you look at entrepreneurship, as represented by our friends on the panel, you look at most government policy, absence the orientation to science, I think all the indicators are very, very, very positive. So.
That's great. Sanjay, just on the back of that, Sona Comstar obviously has been a leader in manufacturing-led innovation, particularly in the auto component space. So how do you see the role of manufacturing evolving in India's mobility revolution, particularly in terms of the transition to electrical mobility and sustainable vehicles?
Yeah, thanks Sandeep, and thanks for having me on this panel. So, the GDP to manufacturing is 17% in what it is in India today, needs to go up to 25%. So manufacturing is going to be key. And when you talk about our demographic dividend, it really is not going to be a benefit if we don't create enough manufacturing jobs. So manufacturing is going to be key. And however, I'm going to go back to Tarun's point on investment in R&D. And I think one of the key aspects of successful manufacturing, especially in the auto component space, is to invest in R&D. Today, our industry average in India is about 0.5%. Our own companies average between 4 and 6%, and therefore, we're able to play in a very different kind of space when it comes to electrification, electric vehicles, etc. So I think the investment in R&D, investment in skilling of people, and making electric vehicles less expensive is really the role that Indian manufacturing has to play going forward. I think we have an expectation of going up to 30% of new vehicles by 2030 to be EV in India alone. However, the real market is the global market, and the only way we can address that challenge is if we invest in R&D. With regard to the government, policies are all in line with private sector making those investments. That's the expectation of government. If you look at the production-linked incentive schemes or the new scheme that the Prime Minister has just launched with regard to incentives for localization of EV components, again, it's in line with investing in new technologies, and new technologies, the requirement comes from private sector. So again, private sector needs to make that investment. There's a new policy in terms of charging infrastructure, which is announced on the 17th of September, in fact, to say that the government will, with public-private partnerships, put up more charging infrastructure. And again, if you look at the manufacturing space, and if I go back to the component space where I have the expertise, it's not just the traditional components, but it's everything else that's coming into manufacturing, whether it be in terms of infrastructure or batteries. Then again, you've got sensors, you've got software, you've got services as well, which will all become part of what is the traditional manufacturing business in India, in the auto component space. So I think, we're sitting at a great I think companies in this generation will define what companies in the auto component space should look like in the future, and what the automotive industry should. And if I just talk about some numbers, we're sitting at about $22 billion worth of exports in India, going to 100 billion. However, in the grand scheme of things, our trade is only 3%. So there's a lot that needs to be done. So, with the challenge comes a lot of opportunities for the manufacturing sector in India. And again, it's investment in R&D. It's centers like this that we need in India, a new lab in India, really to fuel the ecosystem and to fuel the startup ecosystem. So whilst the startup ecosystem exists, there really isn't any opportunity for them to, grow the way that you have startups here, because you've built an ecosystem where people can come, collaborate with each other. You can have testing facilities, you have good R&D facilities, and you have good people. The difference between China and India is really the skilled manpower that they have in China, which we need to replicate in India. I think that's a burning issue, and we need to address that issue, not just from a manufacturing, but from an overall perspective. And then, of course, create more manufacturing so that we can build up to 25% GDP.
That's great. Puneet, Blue Smart, your company, is clearly leading the electrification pivot, in the mobility space. But for an audience that might not appreciate the complexities of mobility in India, how are you uniquely suited to address that pivot to electrification and sustainable vehicles?
Hi everyone. So just as Sandeep mentioned, electrification is quite challenging, but you would know Revel in New York, which is obviously one of the largest ride-hailing companies in New York. Blue Smart is a new age ride-hailing service and EV charging network. We are working on 3 overarching themes. Theme 1 is electrification, second is decarbonization, and the third is modernization of ground transport. We largely have the belief that companies like Uber and Lyft, which are Airbnbs of mobility, will largely struggle to go completely electric, given that they don't invest in EVs and they don't invest in EV infrastructure. Anmol, my co-founder, and I, we have been serial entrepreneurs in the clean energy space. We have built out few solar power plants and exited them in the past. So we know E of energy and I of infra. And we thought about it in 2017 that India will now need electrification. So we came with a different concept, and we said that how we look at this business is that we should build out an energy, infra, mobility, and technology company in alphabetical order, largely using charging infrastructure to power large EV fleets, and then launching something to compete with Uber. So actually, it's a very funny story. We launched on the Uber platform. When Blue Smart started, we launched our ride-hailing service on Uber, and we used their platform to start Blue Smart, and then we pivoted and launched our own ride-hailing app.
Just as a point of note, Blue Smart is known as the Uber Slayer for that comment for Puneet.
But it was fascinating because we partnered with Uber initially, and we learned from them mobility, because we didn't know R of ride-hailing and M of mobility. But we knew obviously what energy and infra was all about. And we were on the Uber platform for all of 2019, and we graduated from Uber's class of 2019 in December. But we haven't looked back since then. We had 300 cars back in December 19. I remember Rajat Gupta here, one of our early investors. When he came to our office, we had 40 cars on our ride-hailing service. When Sandeep invested, we had around 1,200 cars. 1,200 cars, and today we operate India's and South Asia's largest EV charging network and ride-hailing service. We have about 8,300 cars. The biggest challenge for any company in the electrification space, like even Sanjay mentioned, is investing in EV infrastructure, and that is something that one needs to do. So we are building a vertically integrated, full stack ride-hailing service and charging network, and with a overlay of technology. The tech stack connects the ride-hailing business and the charging business. So we are doing all the three things: energy, infrastructure, and technology. And I think that's the right way to really solve the electrification challenge or opportunity at the same time. And that's what we are, trying to do a little bit.
So you've actually solved the chicken and egg problem, because obviously one of the reasons why electrical mobility is not taken off is people are saying, there's no charging infrastructure, so why should I buy? How did you do that basically in India?
So it's a long story. I was, in fact, back in 2017 in the US, and I was, when I was done with my solar venture, I was trying to look out for something new. And I had a chance meeting with a gentleman called Brent Kalinikis, whom I met in Nevada, and in Los Angeles. He showed me something called Hyperloop One, and they were building these pods in which you can travel at great speeds. And I also met Sherwin Peshawar. He was, a Series B investor in Uber. And Brent was CFO of Uber between 13, 14, 15 circa. He was also on the board of Baidu, Philips Fanhausen, and others. And we were talking about electrification of mobility and what Uber may go through or may not go through in the future. And to which Brent said something very interesting, that infrastructure will play a very important role, and charging stations will play a very important role. So why don't you go and see the Google facility? So I went to Menlo Park, and I went to the Google campus, where I saw solar panels were charging a charging station, in turn charging an EV. It was an amazing ecosystem. And I already was doing my research in the EV space, and I knew that charging infrastructure was challenging. And with that idea and mindset, we came back, and we started building the idea that let's build a cohesive network where the ride-hailing business can become the anchor tenant to the charging infrastructure network. The charging infrastructure business can then become the bedrock on which the ride-hailing business can scale. So both the businesses support each other, and you don't need to really depend on third-party charging, and neither the charging infrastructure operator needs to invest upfront and wait for demand to happen. And I think you can probably solve this by building both businesses together. And obviously, we knew energy infrastructure business very well, given a background in renewable energy and building solar power plants, and we leveraged that to build out the charging infra and the ride-hailing business together.
Fantastic. I mean, for those who are interested in reading more about Blue Smart, IIM Ahmedabad is possibly writing a case study on you guys, which you guys will be able to follow soon enough in December. Tarun, you've also been involved on the venture side in India, being a founding advisor to a mobility venture cap fund, Axelor Ventures. And obviously, one of the things that I've seen is that innovation and sustainability go hand in hand. So the question that I have is, what lessons can we draw from India's approach to innovation in the mobility sector that can be applied globally, in your view? Yeah.
I want to flip the question and say, how can we, forward-looking, improve India's different nexus points between parts of the ecosystem? Because I think we should be forward-looking rather than. So I think, and this actually connects to Newlab's value proposition in some ways. I think if you look at, so I was a co-founder of Axelor Labs, which is a big tech incubator with the Infosys co-founders in Bangalore. And mobility is a piece of it, but we do a lot of other deep tech startups. I think the two things that neither we at Axelor nor anybody else in India do well is the backward and forward linkages, right? From that tech ecosystem. And by backward linkages, I mean linkages to the academic institutions. So my home is in the Boston tech ecosystem, which is sort of the mecca of life science investing, right? So I live in the middle of the Harvard and Kendall MIT ecosystems. And every day, well, not every day, once a week, there is somebody who comes by my office with a scientific gimmick, right? Partly because people know that I like it, and so they naturally gravitate to it. But it's so much fun to be able to take that idea and to say, hey, how can we see this actually get traction in the real world? That nexus, that chemistry between science in India, not just India, but all developing countries, and the pool of young, smart, risk-taking entrepreneurs is missing in India. Right? We just don't have that backward linkage. You know, here and there, a guy like Puneet will show up and say, I went to Nevada and I found an idea and something magical happened and I did it. But that's vanishingly small. We should be able to 10x, 100x, 1000x that. And that's what will drive the skilling that Sanjay's talking about also, as much as public policy and attempts to wake up the schooling system and so on the forward side, you know, Cam and I were talking earlier today about one of the things that I think Newlab's done really well is these innovation, sorry, I forgot the name, innovation studios, yeah, innovation studios, which is very simple to say, but it's hand-holding between the startup at Newlab and a company, which is the destination for that idea or that set of ideas, or a partner company which can serve as a prototype partner for, which is what you need for almost any innovation, but particularly for things that have a physical form factor. You need some kind of tapestry within which to play with it. That forward linkage to corporations in India, you know, is less underdeveloped than the backward linkage, but still pretty underdeveloped. But you know, I'm an optimist, glass half full, so wherever it's underdeveloped, there's a lot of room both on the backward side and the forward side. And that's what I'd like to see us do much better. And to Sanjay's admonition, I think he's basically issued an invite to you to come to India. But that kind of capability is very much in short supply. So that's what I would advocate.
You know, I've heard.
So Sandeep, I want to say
Please.
something about this because it's very interesting because the academia business industry connect, what we call, is absolutely required. And what's happening today in India, what the government has allowed us is to plow back CSR, corporate social responsibility money into startups. So as an organization, we have funded startups in IIT. We would typically never fund OEM or vehicle manufacturers because we're in the component space and we don't want to take any kind of risk with our other OEMs to say we are funding them. But as a CSR project, we have funded, three-wheeler manufacturers, two-wheeler, and it's companies like ours that have to play a bigger role, as Tarun's rightly saying, in the industry academia connect, because there is a lot of people that can get you to prototype, but how do you get to commercialization and productionization? And that's really the role that industry needs to play. And it's happening, not at the speed that it should be happening at, but it's happening. I just wanted to add that.
Oh, that's great. Just a couple of points, Arun, on that. It's argued that the reason why innovation is not happening in India, particularly as rapidly as it should, is that India is a very punitive place for a startup founder. I mean, I'm sure Puneet has experience having launched finally his third startup that's working. The first two didn't work. The second worked, but not as much as you would have liked it to work, but the third is definitely working. But it's really interesting because if you look at some of the best startups that are coming out of the United States, you'll find that the startup founders here are non-American nationals who've actually come over from India and China and Australia and England. And so basically that needs to change. I mean, India needs to start sort of celebrating failure rather than punishing failure. And I think you'll actually see that increase in innovation, taking risk on innovation go up. That's point number one. The second thing, in terms of regulatory innovation, the charging infrastructure problem was a big one in India. And the government did something really smart. And I don't know who advised the government on this idea, but it was a great idea, which is that they decoupled the ownership of the car with the battery. The moment you do that, not the vehicle with the battery, not necessarily the car with the battery, that just basically led to a mushrooming of swapping business, because basically, one, the asset price went down because the battery was no longer a cost of the asset. And secondly, it incentivized people to set up businesses to support battery as a service. So regulatory innovation is as necessary to drive, entrepreneurial innovation. And Puneet, I'd like to kind of get a view from you on what do you think the government has done from a regulatory perspective to help your business in India? And if they have done anything, that is. And secondly, Uber has, for whatever reason, lost significant market share, whereas you guys continue to keep growing, even though passenger cars growth in EV segment in India is nowhere close to the two-wheeler and three-wheeler segment. So what is it that you guys are doing differently?
Right, so I'll answer I think, two questions there. So the first one, the role of the government. I think the government in India is doing some fantastic stuff. The FAME policy was a game changer, and they came out with the FAME policy, which really allowed public transportation platforms or operators like Blue Smart and other operators to use the FAME policy, where the government gave discounts and passed on the benefit to operators like Blue Smart.
And what is the FAME policy, just for people?
Yeah, so it was a battery-based kilowatt-hour, policy where they allowed the OEMs to reduce the cost of the asset for the operator like Blue Smart, and that was a $1.5 billion policy that they came out with, and obviously they had FAME 1 and FAME 2 extensions. The government also reduced GST on the cars from 18% to 5% for EVs. There was no registration charge. So if you bought an EV, there was no registration cost, which normally is in the range of 8 to 10% in India, depending on the type of car available. And electrification was imminent for India because the crude oil import for India back in 2017, when I in fact was pitching the idea of Blue Smart to the Niti Aayog CEO back in 2018, and he said that if companies like you build use EVs at scale, India will obviously save on tons of money in terms of crude oil import, and that number was 60 billion in circa 2018, and that number now has swelled to almost 120 billion. And if we don't control that, that'll go north of 200 billion. So obviously, electrification is imminent and necessary. The overarching theme again here is decarbonization. So how we saw this business was that initially, obviously, to operate thousands of cars, we needed to use energy from the central grid. But then we stepped back and told ourselves that no, we will also use renewable energy now to run the ride-hailing fleet. And I must mention here that Blue Smart is the world's first company which uses completely green and renewable energy to run this massive fleet. We partnered with Tata Power for an offtake agreement of 32 megawatts, which translates into 72 million units of annual energy access. So we use 72 million units of clean and green energy, which in turn powers our charging infrastructure and then powers EVs.
So end-to-end green.
End-to-end green. This is exactly what Brent had foretold when I went to the Google campus back in 2018. To your second point of Uber. So see, Uber is an Airbnb of mobility, and largely, if I read their last 10, 15 quarters of the balance sheet is on the website. If you see their revenue, 68% of the global mobility revenue of Uber comes from the US. They operate in 5 continents. There are 7 continents in the world. 2 continents, Asia and Australia, which is APAC, contributes nearly 13% to Uber's global revenue. India contributes 2.25%. Essentially, if you write a paper for a business school, they are a global company, but a majority of the revenue comes from North and South America. About 72% of the global revenue of Uber comes from 2 continents, North and South America. In India, the biggest challenge for them is supply. The biggest advantage for Uber in the US is supply. The biggest disadvantage for them in India is supply. Largely, they are unable to add new cars on the platform. Drivers are not keen to buy cars on the Uber platform. In the US, it's a $2 trillion automobile economy, and which is half of India's GDP. So it's a different market size here. The average asset ownership in the US is about 650 cars per 1,000 people. In India, it's 40 cars per 1,000 people. It's largely a 2- and 3-wheeler market. And there we saw an opportunity that we said, okay, the driver should not be owning assets. A driver is not a Macquarie, not a JP Morgan, not a Fairfax, not a BlackRock or Blackstone. Driver's core skill set is to drive and not be an asset owner. Also, driving is a very serious job. You should go behind the wheel only stress-free and with no worries. You can't go behind the wheel with so much of stress in your life, how to pay the EMI, how to pay the cost of the fuel and all that. So we absolutely decouple the driver from asset ownership and got institutional financing for our cars, and that's why we completely differ from Uber's model. And this is why we believe that Uber needs us, or needs companies like Blue Smart to sustain in India. They are having an existential crisis, and this kind of business model of aggregation won't work in this decade and the decade thereafter. It's the decade of asset creation. infrastructure investments. So we need to invest in world-class EV assets and EV infrastructure to set the path forward.
That's interesting. Tarun, everything that we learned in business school now needs to go out of the window, right?
No,
Yeah,
somebody,
asset-light ownership.
no, somebody has to create the assets. I mean, you enjoy Airbnb because somewhere 300-400 years ago, those buildings were made in Europe and which are being put on the Airbnb today or 200 years ago. But till you don't create assets, what will you monetize? So you can't create an Airbnb of electric mobility because the assets only don't exist. So you can only create an Airbnb on something when the assets do exist.
Got it. Thanks for that.
By the way, the biggest fortunes in all emerging markets for the last 100 years have been created in infrastructure creation, period. It has nothing to do with clean or whatever, just in general, which makes sense. In the end, you know, when you think about the transition from an agrarian economy to a semi-developed to a developed economy, it's soft and hard infrastructure creation that is the
Cash flows are
defining-
asset linked. If you don't have any asset, how do you create cash flow?
It's kind of,
Yeah, I get that.
yeah.
Get that. Sanjay, India is rapidly or has already become a global hub for automotive manufacturing. How do companies like Sona Comstar contribute to the global supply chain in a way that prioritizes sustainability as well as reduce the overall global carbon footprint?
So, Sandeep, you know, I mean, we are driven by two things are driving us. One is regulation, and the other is customer demand when it comes to sustainability. And I think I would say the third thing which I would put in customer is when you recruit people now, people want to know how sustainable you are as a business. So these are things that are anyway driving change in business. When you look at the kind of sort of regulations that exist when we supply into Europe, they're extremely stringent when it comes to sustainability. Much more stringent than they are in the US. So our entire supply chain needs to be sustainable. You know, so we are doing, I think, almost 34% of our material goes through recycling. You know, we have, which is mostly steel and castings. You know, then we have a supply chain that is forced to adopt clean energy, renewable energy. We've got rooftop solar, wind energy, and all that. And India is growing in that space. We're also recycling water. We generate almost 12,000 liters of clean water, etc. Other than that, you know, I think it's also a matter of now reporting through your supply chain. So there's a new regulation that's being talked about. It's not in practice yet, but it's driven by the stock exchange, the SEBI, the stock exchange, to say that the top 250 companies have to report how sustainable their entire supply chain is. So again, it's becoming very driven towards clean energy. Though we have a carbon footprint, neutral carbon footprint of 2070 goal, I think that's pretty far out. I think 2050 is sort of something that we should aim for. However, companies are being forced to adopt sustainable practices, and again, it's driven by lots of different agencies, not just our customers, but also by regulation and demand. So I think, and as a business, this last year we planted 50,000 trees, and we'll plant double of that next year. And again, these are projects that we're doing to see how we can reduce the carbon footprint. I think electrification of trucks, even though trucks could go hydrogen, I think electrification of trucks for mining, for companies that are in cement, etc., is going to become very big, because again, it's adding to carbon neutral from their perspective.
Great. Tarun, India's diversity presents a lot of unique challenges and opportunities. So how do we ensure as a country that our business decision makers and our policy makers basically create policies that are not only scalable, but are also adaptable to that diversity? Climate solutions or climate policy.
I think, Puneet's been talking about electrification so that it reduces India's fossil fuel dependency and lowers the FX bill and so on. But when you think about mobility in general, and you think about climate adaptation as an aggregate problem space, it is much vaster than what we're talking about, right? I'll give you one example. If you want to anchor, it's not clear how you translate this into a commercialization, but I'll just spell out the problem statement just to expand the conversation a little bit, right? Because we're talking about cars and cars, but actually climate is much bigger than cars, right? And mobility is much broader than cars. Much of mobility in India is people moving, like individuals moving in search of jobs and so on. Many of them are nomadic movements, like 400 million people are moving in circles round and round. Anybody check the temperatures in the Indo-Gangetic Plain in the last 5 years? They're hitting 53 degrees Celsius, right? Estimates of excess death last year in India are in the maybe tens of millions. We don't have good measures. Tens of millions extra people die because of heat waves. Tens of millions. Yeah? We need clever solutions, right? This ecosystem can play a role. That's connected to mobility. It's connected to heat, right? So far, we're talking about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with an indirect measure of heat. There's actually heat deaths right now, and there's payoffs to reducing those even right now. Why am I saying that in response to your question? Your question about diversity triggered that thought, right? So when you think about climate-related problems to mobility, some of it comes from water issues, river flooding issues, some comes from extreme heat stress. I think the innovation tapestry is wide open, wide open. That's why it's such an exciting space to play in. And you know, I mean, India has really high quality human capital, even in policy-making circles. And fortunately, in the last 5, 7, 10 years, as Puneet was alluding to, there are forward-looking bureaucrats who are thinking about it. I think the rest of us just need to enable that conversation and catalyze it and encourage it. You know, when I was growing up in India, it was, I wouldn't say fashionable, but commonplace to point fingers at the government, right? If you were from the private sector side, that, oh, it's the government, it's not going to do anything, you know. That's not a helpful attitude. I think a more helpful attitude is all these partners need to get together to leverage the diversity of India and solve not just the problems that we're focused on right now, but to solve incredibly large-scale problems.
Just on that point of 53 degrees, those were the wet bulb temperatures. So that's the average across land and sea. So if you actually just take the land temperatures, it's about 4 to 5 degrees more than sea temperatures. Imagine in India, the actual heat on land is 57 or 58 degrees Celsius, which means that if you don't have air conditioners, God help.
So let me give you a concrete example. So I'm leading an academic study at Harvard and MIT with a bunch of climate scientists. And for the first time, we are in partnership with a big NGO in Gujarat, Seva, which represents informal workers. We are recruiting workers, informal workers, to wear sensors on their body for the first time in the world in large scale. Hundreds, maybe 1,000 poorer people who work in the informal economy and are engaged in mobility, right, are wearing sensors 24/7, 365 days, so that we can actually get wet bulb temperature exposures at the individual level. It's unbelievable. We don't have the data to create solutions or policy. We don't, you know, there's a project underway between, I think it's either Munich Re or Swiss Re, the big reinsurance companies in Europe, to create parametric insurance, individual parametric insurance products. So this is a capital market solution that has real cash associated with it to the entrepreneurs in the room, right? That says that, okay, if you're a worker who's exposed to 53 degrees temperature, by the way, wet bulb temperatures in excess of 37 Celsius kills you, okay, 37. Yeah. Sustained exposure to wet bulb temperatures in excess of 37 degrees kills you, let alone 53, right? But if you have ambient wet bulb temperatures, let's call it north of 40 degrees, it pays you to not have that worker go and work. Yeah. Right? So the minute it hits that, you should pay them their daily wage so that they sit at home. Otherwise, taxpayer pays the bill. So there's a lot of cash to be made and people to be much better off through clever solutions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Sanjay, let's come back to the manufacturing issue. Obviously, you've had, a sense of the rising costs associated with adapting green technologies. So the question is, are there any challenges outside of higher costs in adapting greener technologies in manufacturing? And if you've done that, how do you basically remain competitive in a world which is not adapting to green technologies?
So I think, you can't remain competitive, if you don't adapt to green technologies, because everything is moving in that way. And yes, it's an upfront cost, and you talk about cost, it's an upfront cost. It's like R&D. It's like quality used to be. People used to complain about the fact that if I implement this, quality system, it's expensive upfront, but I think the long term it plays out. And I think one of the key aspects, and I spoke about that earlier, is skilling. I think getting people, skilled people at the right, for the right jobs is also key. And then that's what we're going to have to focus on to build a more sustainable business. And as Tarun's rightly saying, it's not just about the automotive or the mobility industry as we call it now. It's also about people, and it's also about diversity when it comes to people. Building sustainable businesses about the right ratio of men to women in the workforce. Again, that's another key role or key focus area from India's perspective. So I think it's, again, whilst cost becomes a big factor, in terms of upfront costs and how do you scale a business with that kind of cost. And that's really, you've got to look at it from our industry. If I go back to the auto component industry, 70% is in the small and medium enterprise. So what we call the MSME or the SME, the small medium enterprises. And those companies don't make enough money to plow back into their business. And very often in manufacturing, their land becomes more valuable than the business. So what do you do there? And it becomes a vicious cycle. So I think companies like ours that are larger are going to have to, work with the supply chain. And again, to the point where I think government has done enough, frankly. I think with all the schemes that the government has from our industry, I'm pretty satisfied with what the government has done for us. Now it's up to private sector. Government has made a lot of investment in infrastructure in India. The private sector has fallen back in terms of investing, in R&D and investing in capital expenditure. So I think it's time that we step up to the plate, or businesses step up to the plate and invest in that capex, so that we can reap the benefits of a more sustainable business.
You guys have won several green awards I've been watching. I mean, can you give us an example of a couple of things that your company has done that set you guys apart from others?
Yeah,
and made you win those awards?
I think I talked about it. I talked about the fact that, circular economy, a lot of our supply chain is recycled material, about rooftop solar. We've built green buildings, all the water that we recycle, etc. So, again, the trees that we plant, it's all moving towards, not just for the sake of winning awards, but because I feel we need to build a more sustainable business. You're right, because at 53 degrees centigrade, we're all going to die. It's not just, and then you've got pollution, which is the added sort of danger, and we're sitting in a very, very critical stage. And it's not vehicular pollution that is impacting us. It's also dust. It's also construction, forest, stubble burning, etc. All that is adding to the pollution, and we have to find solutions, for that, and we have to find solutions to build a cleaner environment for the future generations.
Yeah, point of note, I was in Delhi last November, and I was with you, and we checked the AQI, and it was 1500, by the way. And 80 is a bad day in New York for AQI, just to give you a perspective.
So it's a PM 2.5 that you need to worry about, and yeah, it is terrible.
Yeah. Puneet, there's obviously a rapid urbanization taking place in India. People have talked about electrification of vehicles and mobility being really a tier 1 market opportunity. How do you scale to tier 2 and tier 3 cities? Or have you chosen to just focus on tier 1? And if you have decided to focus on tier 2 and tier 3 as well, because that's where 80% of India's population is, how important are local partnerships to be able to do that?
No, I don't agree that electrification is only a tier 1 phenomena, and electrification will happen at scale across tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities. It's just that what is right for Blue Smart is different. I'll just speak for electrification.
Yeah, why do you say that? Why do you think it's a not just a tier 1?
Because India is largely fragmented. So we have 40 cars per 1,000 people, but we have about 700 two-wheelers and three-wheelers per 1,000 people. So largely electrification at scale will happen for 2 and 3-wheelers. You are investor in one of the largest battery swapping companies. So we believe that the 2 and 3-wheeler market will probably be the market where electrification 1.0, 2.0 will happen over the next 5-10 years. Mega cities have mega challenges. So Delhi NCR, Bangalore and Mumbai, the Trinity, is different than a Hyderabad or a Chennai or a Calcutta. Right? So Los Angeles, San Francisco and New York is different than Seattle, Chicago or Houston or Texas or some other city. Same way in the UK, Birmingham, Manchester and London are different than Edinburgh, Dublin and Leeds and some other cities. So largely mobility in any part of the world is a classic Pareto's principle. It's largely basically a 3-city phenomena. You go to Germany, you have Berlin or Munich or Frankfurt to worry about. You don't really worry about Dresden in Germany. And this is why we believe that in ride hailing also, Delhi NCR, Mumbai and Bangalore put together 70% of India's ride hailing and mobility market. That is where we believe that we have a huge, huge opportunity to grow. Ubers and Olas, which are 2 ride-hailing platforms in India, like Uber and Ola, like Uber and Lyft equivalent in India. Their key markets are Delhi, NCR, Mumbai, and Bangalore. And this is where there are phenomenal, there are massive challenges and phenomenal opportunities. So our core focus will be to scale here. And this is where people are willing to pay also more for our kind of service. People are not worried about anything else than time. Time is money in these places. Uber has a huge challenge in India. There are massive ride denials on the Uber India platform. So if you try to summon an Uber, 6 out of 10 times, or maybe 7 out of 10 times, the ride will be denied by the driver. The driver is the micro entrepreneur. He or she decides the fate of whether you will make it to the airport or not. It's not Uber. Uber is just connecting you to the closest driver as a Match.com of mobility. But it's the driver who is in charge of the asset, and the driver decides whether you make it that day to your meeting, to Newlab or to the airport or not. And that's a very wrong thing. And we said, okay, we will change that completely, and we did that by decoupling the driver from the asset, by being an asset operator and a ride-hailing service coupled. So we are playing 2 parts in this journey. And now in terms of GDP per capita of India is $2,400. The GDP per capita of China, I think, is about $11,500. But the GDP per capita of these top 3 cities of India are equal to China. So Bangalore's GDP per capita is $25,000. Delhi's GDP per capita is $7,000. Mumbai's GDP per capita is about $10,500. This trinity, these 3 cities, equal GDP per capita of China. And this is where the key market opportunity lies, and people are willing to pay a bit more for better service, reliability, safety, and these are things that we offer, better than Uber. I mean, with due respect to if Singaporeans or Malaysians here, Malaysian Airlines is a good airline, but Singapore Airlines is a top-notch airline. So Uber India could be AirAsia or Malaysian Airlines or somebody like that, and Blue Smart is Etihad, Emirates, or Singapore Airlines for mobility. And yeah.
Makes sense.
Just Sandeep, one point on electrification in rural India. Electricity is free when you get it, right? So that is also going to drive demand for electric vehicles in rural India, because electricity is free.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, just as an additional data point, which I've not seen any other country in the world offer that India offers is a big advantage. 65 cities in India have populations of more than 1 million people. Think about it, 65. So, I mean, do you really want to go outside those cities and try and tackle, mobility from an electrical perspective when you have such low-hanging fruit with bad experience among consumers with the existing ride-hailing platforms? I agree. that opportunity is really great. As we kind of get into the last part of our panel questions, I'd like to kind of start the penultimate round by focusing a question on Tarun. What role do you think an academic institution like Harvard or a climate accelerator like Newlab can play in accelerating the adoption of sustainable mobility solutions? And can they influence policy and industry practices?
I don't think it's a Harvard thing. I think it's an Indian university thing. So we have amazing human capital in the universities in India. It just is a little bit uncatalyzed in the median universities. I mean, there are always exceptions, but some of our institutions are really amazing. I co-led the Institutes of Eminence program for the Prime Minister's office for some years and got to see all the capabilities of the universities. I think there is nothing wrong with our human capital. We just need to be clever about unlocking it. And when I say we, it's the collective we. It's the government, it's the private sector, the entrepreneurs, it's the Sanjays and the Puneets and everybody else participating in this. And we need to find receptive academics in these institutions. If there are, 100 academics, probably 2 of them will be willing to play ball and, work with those 2. That's a good starting point. Yeah. It's a proof of concept. And then others will copy it once you show. So I think a little bit of proactivity on everybody's part can go a long way. I think the whole ecosystem is important. It would be terrific if Newlab showed up in India, and if CAM doesn't show up, I'll encourage somebody to start Newlab in India, right? Because you guys have shown that it works. So if you're not going to come, then we're going to start our own. Yeah. It's that simple, yes. Because we need it. Yeah, so chop, let's get on with it. But we need that tapestry. We need that hand-holding function. We need the translation of science to ideation to commercialization chain to be created, and everybody has a role to play.
Great. Sanjay, I've asked you this question before on a panel in the United Kingdom, but I'm going to actually ask you this again for the benefit of the viewers today. What innovations are you most excited about that could significantly impact the future of mobility in India specifically?
So I think, from my perspective, and I said AI, I talked about AI, in manufacturing. We're seeing more and more adoption of AI in manufacturing. And I'm from the core, I'm a manufacturing guy, and I honestly believe that we have to do a lot more in manufacturing. We find a lot of startups in services, very few in manufacturing, and that's something that we really need to stress on, because that's really what will put us on the growth path. So I feel it's AI in manufacturing, in processes, and we're using a lot of AI when it comes to manufacturing, in terms of reduction of cycle time, et cetera, for manufacturing. The other big initiative I think needs to come in terms of the circular economy. I think the circular economy is going to become very, very important as we develop technologies. There's a lot that can be done, and there's a lot of business models around that. And again, when I look at the business model, it's not just circular economy, but it's also collection of waste, processing of waste, recycling, reusing. So if you look at today, the tire business, there's so much to be done in terms of recycling of tires and reusing that rubber. And it may not be critical use, because there's technical stuff in terms of how you extract carbon black and remove zinc and silicon. I won't get into that, but non-critical tires, non-critical rubber can be used. So I think recycling is also a big play. And then India has very ambitious targets of becoming 10% of the global supply of green hydrogen by 2030. We want to become the 3rd largest battery storage by 2040. So I think in energy, and when you look at companies like ourselves, today we're in mobility, tomorrow we may be in energy. And we need to look at businesses from that aspect. We also need to leverage what India's been able to do in the IT industry. what we'll be able to scale up and build global businesses in the IT industry, we need to leverage that. And again, to Tarun's point of the talent pool that exists in India, how do we keep them in India, build the right ecosystem, for them to flourish in India, and build businesses like Battery Smart / the Singapore Airlines of, ride-hailing, and continue to grow in that from that aspect.
Perfect. What are the challenges that keep you up at night as Blue Smart? What keeps you up at night? Because you seem to be doing everything right.
I mean, personally, what keeps me up at night is my ambition. But I think the only thing that keeps you up at night is your ambition, nothing else. I mean, and if you're less ambitious, you can sleep well. But I think what keeps us up at night is the fact that if we don't roll out large-scale charging infrastructure, our growth will be stalled. Our business is quite linear. The more we invest, the more we grow. So we need to invest in EV infrastructure, we need to invest in EV assets, and we need to scale, I'm sure. And I just reminded when Rajat ji invested in our company, we just had 40 cars. We had no idea, zilch nada, no idea that we'll come this far, but we had the belief and ambition. We had a clear path that somebody has to do it, Uber, Ola, Blue Smart, or some other smart. But there's an opportunity that an opportunity requires tons of investment. So challenge one could be, are we building enough EV infrastructure? How are we building that EV infrastructure? Where is the capital coming from? What are the sources of capital? I'm here also for a fundraiser right now. We're trying to stitch a very large round. But this is all, you need to do a lot of these things to do. Also, charging infrastructure is extremely challenging. It sounds pretty easy, but it's not. Every city has two finite challenges. One is finite real estate, finite prime real estate, and then finite power load. So you have to get the power load, you have to find the right location, you have to build the EV infrastructure, and then you have to utilize it from day one, because you can't let your investment go. So you have to connect so many dots, and that is obviously quite challenging. Then obviously the industry is pretty new, and Blue Smart is a new age ride-hailing platform taking on the mighty giants Uber and Ola, and obviously that's also very challenging for us to keep telling ourselves that it can be done and it should be done. So something which is imminent and necessary and important. But yeah.
I'm going to speak to you at the end of this panel, because you obviously have a lot of challenges, and I'm sure you sleep. So I need to figure out what you eat or drink to sleep, so I can get the same.
I mean, you need to work out and run and get tired and sleep.
Last question, 30 seconds each of you guys have to answer this. What is the one critical step that India must take in the next decade to make sure that its mobility revolution not only leads to sustainable growth, but also serves as a beacon for global climate action? 30 seconds, each of you. Who wants to start?
I'll take less than 30. Invest in science.
So I think, other than everything that I said in terms in my last response, I think we need to become a global hub for manufacturing for the world. I think that's really what REM should be.
Invest in real infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical. If India has to leapfrog genuinely, with a capital G, genuinely, from a nearly $5 trillion economy to a $15 trillion economy, you'll have to invest $3 trillion in new infrastructure. And if you don't invest in that, then you can't become the next China or the US. The US and China were built on infrastructure investments. And while SaaS and all that is very, very important, the cloud platforms are extremely important, but you need to invest in infrastructure. Invest in new ports, airports, road, railway, manufacturing, new facilities, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure. I think investments will drive India forward to that $15 trillion economy, the aim that our country has over the next 10, 15 years.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I wanted to thank all of you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation, and we hope to see you again next year. Thanks so much.
That was wonderful, guys. Sanjay, Puneet, and Tarun, I really appreciate all your time here. It was a fantastic discussion.